This will be a brief reflection on the course I'll be doing for St. Stephen's University on Erasmus, hermeneutical generosity, and the owl. We live in a time of intense culture wars in which people on the right and the left, the progressives and the conservatives, they freeze in their particular interpretation, whether it's religion or economics or politics or culture or literature. Tendency to cancel one another out. There is an aggressive polarization and grandstanding and rhetorical mudslinging going on. And this is not new. The tendency is to assume we have somehow entered a new phase of human history. Pre the last few decades, people were much more sensitive, irenical, listening, dialogical than in the last 15, 20 years with the Rush Limbaugh, Donald Trump, and those who are the acolytes and followers of that particular way of thinking have initiated a new phase of human history. This, of course, is certainly not true. History is replete with these two tendencies, a more irenical tradition, more of a dovish position, an owlish position, and a more confrontational position. Now, Erasmus in the 16th century lived at a very similar period of time. Obviously, the hot-button issues of the content issues were somewhat different, and yet they weren't different. But the way of approaching conflict and differences remains a perennial issue. Erasmus initially was very supportive of Martin Luther in his critiques of the aberrations of the Roman Catholic Church. He was a part of a reforming movement along with Thomas More, John Colet, and many others to critique at a theological, liturgical, political, economic, exegetical level what he saw were the problems. They were partly called the Oxford Reformers, and Erasmus was central to that. And of course, one of the leading reformers at the time was the emerging Martin Luther. The Oxford reformers of More, Colet, Erasmus were about a decade ahead of Luther, so it's not like somehow Luther was initiating some sort of reform tradition that wasn't already at work in the Roman Catholic Church. There were many, both in England and the continent and in Rome, that was engaged in this. But the point to note here, in Erasmus's contributions, is why I've called the course Hermeneutical Generosity and the Owl, is that there were tendencies within the Roman Catholic Church in reacting to elements of Lutheranism, the Reformed tradition of Calvin, the variations and fragmentation with Anabaptism, Mennonite, to freeze their positions and assume in their interpretation of the Bible their particular read was the absolute interpretation of the text, and those who differed with them were the problem. They were distorting the faith. They were heretics. They were heterodox. Erasmus pleaded again and again in both the Roman Catholic Church and with Luther. Calvin comes a little later. Anabaptists, many of the early Anabaptists were emerging at the same time, that people learn to listen to one another. For we are all finite, we are all fallible, we all see through a glass darkly. And he was acutely aware that the danger is of people, in this case religion, theology, slipped into politics as well, nation state and religion, is that people freeze their own read. They use the language of God to justify it, then they turn viciously on one another, either intellectually, or worst case, they break into different denominations, and the extreme reductio ad absurdum of that, of course, is military violence. Erasmus pleaded again and again at a whole variety of levels that people should put their guns in their holster, and in fact they could learn much from one another. At a variety of levels, Erasmus was at the forefront of bringing the Bible to the fore. His Latin translation critiqued elements of the Vulgate that played a very significant role in the Reformation. Erasmus was one of the key figures in turning to the Eastern Fathers. His work on Chrysostom, the two Gregories, Basil was at the forefront of recovering orthodox thinking for the West. His work on Jerome, his work on Augustine. Erasmus's favorite exegete and theologian was Origen. He was foundational to his thinking, and reviving Origen was at the heart of Erasmus's thinking. His second mentor was Jerome. Both were biblical exegetes, and they realized you can't do theology without proper exegesis. People who systematize the text that can't be systematized will inevitably distort theology and distort faith and distort ecclesiology and politics itself. So Erasmus was at the forefront of reclaiming the richness and the motherlode of the Christian tradition. He refused to slip into East-West, either-or polarities as a way of thinking. In the rise of Protestantism is once again Erasmus who is saying the reformers, particularly the Protestant reformers, are onto something. The danger is they freeze their particular interpretation. With Luther particularly, it was the justification by grace through faith, a certain read of Romans and Galatians. And Erasmus would say to Luther, listen, we both agree on the importance of the Bible. Our difference is not on the authority of the text. It's about you insisting your interpretation of the text as the same authority of the text itself. So you have what's called a deuteronomic authority rather than the text itself. What Erasmus did, he said, listen, this is how the fathers of the East have collided and have their differences in how you read the text. This is how the fathers of the West have done exactly the same thing. So he had annotations in all of his works on the New Testament pointing out there is a polyphony within the Christian tradition, and it behooves one and all, if they're going to really heal the unity of the church, and Erasmus, if nothing else, was the great dove and the great healer calling for unity in the church, one has to understand that there is a polyphonic vision in the church in which various members hear one another, whether that's East or West, or whether it was Protestant or Catholic. So Erasmus was essential to all of that. He also was at the forefront as a political peacemaker. His work on complaint of peace was using the language of the peacemaker, the dove, complaining that, in fact, even though people held high the language of peace or of the dove, in fact, they were constantly using religious language, political language, to again and again put arrows in the heart of the dove and shoot the dove. Erasmus was not an absolute pacifist in terms of an absolute dove, but he certainly wasn't a hawk. He was an owl. And an owl is one who always has to find a middle way discerningly between the certainties and the extremes of either element, whether it's exegesis, theology, political correctness in our culture wars. Again and again arguing, listen, both sides are onto something, but they're often blind to their own limitations, faults, and fallibilities. And so his question would always be, what's the goodness of what you're up to in thought, word, and deed, but what might be the blind spots in a way of thinking? And both sides have to answer those questions. So his hermeneutical generosity was such that he was open to various ways of understanding, interpreting the text, the Christian tradition, and recognizing it was polyphonic, and so much could be learned by listening to those who opposed us at the deepest and most significant level. He was an owl in that the owl is the symbol of wisdom and discernment. And so this course is going to look at how Erasmus understood hermeneutical generosity and the role of the owl, or the discerning one, who doesn't jump too quickly to certainty, to conclusions, does not cancel people out. Just as it's done today, it was done in the 16th century, and of course from the 16th century to the 21st, there's a recycling of that again and again and again. We'll be looking at, as a part of the course, we'll start with Erica Rummel's work on Erasmus, which is a wonderful overview in a compact way. Then we'll move on to Michael Massing's important book called Fatal Discord, on how Erasmus and Luther began seemingly on the same page, actually Luther fawning at the feet of Erasmus with his early translation of the New Testament, and then finally Luther turning viciously on Erasmus. And in that sense, the culture wars we face today are just secularized versions of Luther and many of the religious culture wars of the 16th century. We'll then move on to Erasmus's Methodus. It's his method of interpreting the text, which is very, very important to understand what was going on. We'll use my book, Erasmus Wild Bird, because the tendency, everyone wanted to claim Erasmus in the 16th century, but he refused to be caged. In that sense, he was a wild bird. that refuse to be drawn into the cage of any doctrinal, dogmatic, ecclesial certainty. And so this will be the overview of Erasmus, and hopefully by the end we'll get a sense of how to transcend culture wars, tribalism, dogmatism, and then apply that particular way of thinking of hermeneutical generosity as owls into our contemporary context of the culture wars, where you have ignorant armies, as it were, as Matthew Arnold would say, who fight by day and fight by night and neither listen to one another. And how can Erasmus, as an agent of wisdom, discernment, as the owl, move us forward and beyond these paralyzed, caged perspectives in which, as Shakespeare would say, we get cabin cribbed and confined into certain very limited interpretations of the big issues of life.